Okay, next up, we have Amy Bush. Amy Bush is a hydrologist with RMBJ Geo LLC with over 20 years of experience working with and for groundwater conservation districts in a variety of roles. She has a BS in hydrology and water resource engineering from Tarleton State University. And just a tidbit, it is Amy's birthday, so wish Amy a happy birthday. And with that, I would like to welcome Amy to the stage.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you guys for having me this afternoon. I don't think it'll hurt Jevin's feelings if I say welcome to nerd number 2 presentation. This is not necessarily a nerd topic. This is more of a legal topic, but I'm going to approach it from more of a nerd perspective and from a perspective of someone who has watched what people have been implementing for a very long time and seen many of the different ways that different areas have used the tools in the toolbox of Chapter 36 to implement those tools and to make it work for their area. So the first thing is I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to ask questions all the way through this. My whole presentation is just questions. So the first thing you need to think about is, do you have a problem? And probably a better question is, do you have a problem yet? There is too much going on in the world of water, particularly in this state with all of our growth, for you to think that you're not going to have a problem if you don't already. And so the question becomes, what's the best way to implement the tools that we have to fix our problems, to solve our problems, to anticipate our problems? So let's ask all the questions. Who, what, when, where, why, and of what importance? This is what my history professor made us answer on any short answer questions, so it's always a good place to start. And you better have a lot more information than that for his essays, I'll tell you. But the main thing I hear from people is, can I do anything and how? So let's start with, can I do anything? Yes, you can. 36116 says you can do a lot of things. I'm not going to read that to you. You can read it yourself, or you can pay a lawyer to read it for you. That's even better. I am not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV. But I'm going to break this down because I did read it, and I'm going to show you kind of the tools that Chapter 36 lays out for you to be able to use. So yes, you can do something. If the next question is how, there are some things you need to consider when you're thinking about how you're going to implement these tools. Who will it affect? Is it affecting the people that you want to affect? What will be affected? Are you going to affect how neighbors view one another? Are you going to affect if and where someone can drill a well? Why will it be affected? And this is one that I think gets lost. Is it going to be affected because you put a rule in and you affected something, that's what you intended to do? Or is it going to be affected because you're saying you're going to put a rule in and people are rushing to the pump? You can sometimes have the opposite effect of what you've intended if it's something that's, I'm going to say, not well thought out or not conveyed to the public properly. When will it be affected? When do you want it to be affected? Is this something that you're trying to anticipate a problem so you don't have an emergency and you can do this slowly over a long period of time? Is it something where you already have an emergency and you need to affect someone right now? And is the effect important? One of the things that I can guarantee is that if you implement any sort of rule, someone is going to be mad. They're going to come to you. They're going to be upset. They're going to tell you all of the ways in which this rule affects them. It's your job as staff and as board to decide if that effect is important. Because let's remember, you're trying to affect them. That's the intent. So let's break down what Chapter 36 says you can do with well spacing. The things in 36116 are property line spacing, spacing between wells, spacing based on well size or production, or spacing adopted by the board. That's pretty broad, spacing adopted by the board. Property line spacing is pretty straightforward. How far are you from the property line? I have seen this be as simple as getting rid of the exemption TDLR allows, where if you cement the well all the way up, you can be within 5 feet of the property line. I've seen districts, their only spacing rule is, we're not going to allow that exemption. You have to be 50 foot from the property line. Simple, straightforward. We just want to give everybody 50 feet. This is a little bit of buffer between neighbors. I've seen this be as complicated as you can base it on what size things are, how, I've seen at least one district I know that had one, depending on how many wells you had and how much water you were producing, up to a half mile from a property line. Spacing between wells is the next thing addressed. And there are multiple ways to look at this. You can put in a spacing between wells, and it doesn't matter what well, what size, whose it is, you're going to make them be 100 feet from each other, or 400 feet from each other, or whatever you decide is best in your area. You can consider it differently if it's spacing between a person's own wells, like the yellow line, or spacing between two different people's wells, like the blue line, or if it's a spacing between a permitted and an exempt well, like the pink line. You can choose to protect exempt wells. You can choose to make it be blanket. You can choose to do things all kinds of different ways, depending on your situation and what you're trying to accomplish. You can do spacing based on well size or production. The bigger the well, the further you have to be from the property line. The bigger the well, the further you have to be from other wells. You can do that based on column pipe size. You can do that based on GPM. I've seen that done multiple ways, and I know a lot of districts that have been doing this type of setup for a very long time. I don't think anybody would argue that the more water you're producing, the more effect you're going to have on the area around you and your wells that are neighboring. Spacing adopted by the board. This one covers a multitude of sins, This one really gets out there. I know there's probably 100 things that people are doing under that heading. The couple that occurred to me when I was putting this together is density limitations. I know several districts who have limitations on, let's say, for every quarter section, which is 160 acres, you can have 1 8 or 2 6s or 4 4s or 8 3s, and it limits the amount of wells you can drill on a certain acreage. That particular setup works pretty well in an area that is mostly ag production and mostly already separated into quarter section property ownership. It worked out really well for them. They've been doing that a very long time. Environmentally sensitive areas. We heard about some spacing limitations around some springs yesterday. They're trying to protect an area that is very sensitive to pumping, that's very environmentally important, and they're just spacing away from it. You can't drill right here. I've also seen this handled in a little bit different way. I'm not sure if this rule is still in effect or not, but at one point, there was a district that allowed, if you have an area that you think is an environmentally sensitive area or an area you would like to see protected, and you will set it aside in a conservation reserve acreage, they would allow you to use those acres for your production limit at another spot. So you don't lose the ability to produce based on those acres, but you can still protect the environmentally sensitive area. I'm also hearing a lot of talk about spacing between wells in different aquifers. If you have several different aquifers that you are managing and monitoring, you need to think about if you are going to make these well spacings apply even if the two wells are in different aquifers, or if you're only going to space between wells in the same aquifer. I've even got a district that I know is considering spacing limitations in one aquifer being significantly less restrictive, because that aquifer is deeper, the TDS is higher, it's less, the quality of that water is just quite a bit less good. They're talking about allowing closer to property lines, closer spacings, because that water is deeper, and the people who really can afford to drill for it are the oil and gas companies. They're trying to incentivize those guys who can use that higher TDS water to drill deeper, to get those that worse quality water for use that's really not useful so much for drinking water, for cattle, for irrigation. There's 100 ways you can look at this that can fit your area. These are production limitation options. I'm going to kind of skip to the production part. Part of these are specifically listed in Chapter 36. Part of these are just things we've seen around the state. I'm going to take these one by one, so I'm not going to read them all to you. Production limit per well is the first thing Chapter 36 talks about. This is pretty straightforward. The districts I know that use this have a process something like this. A city needs a well. They know they need 400 acre feet a year. They apply for 400 acre feet a year. They're required to run a permit to make sure that that amount of production is not going to adversely affect the aquifer more than the district thinks is reasonable. And then they grant that permit for just that amount of water that they've asked for the permit for that well. Production limit per acre or tract size. Also pretty straightforward. If you own 100 acres and the production limit's 1 acre foot an acre, you get a permit for 100 acre feet. As Brittany said yesterday, that's not a guarantee that you can produce 100 acre feet. It's a limit on what you're allowed to produce. Production limit per acre is assigned to a well site. At first glance, this seems like the last thing we talked about, but it's not quite. This is a limit on the amount of acres that you can associate with any single permit. So for example, if you have 2,500 acres, unlike in the previous example where you get all of those acres and you just grant a permit of your production limit times your acres, there's a limit on the amount of acres you're allowed to associate with that permit. So if you have 2,500 acres, you have 1,000 acres that you have the limit on the amount you're allowed to associate together. Production limit's 18 inches or 1.5 feet per acre. You only get the 1,500 acre feet on your permit. It's not that you can't use those other acres, but you have to go drill over there and associate other acres together to use that. This has recently come under fire. There'll be a lawsuit about this coming up very soon. I guess we'll see how that goes, but that's a pretty straightforward production limit per acre is assigned to a well site in Chapter 36.116. Production limit using gallons per minute per well site per acre. This is a mouthful, and it's a little bit different method than the rest of those, which limit total volume. This limits instantaneous production. So if you have a rule that says you can only produce 4 gallons a minute per acre, you have 100 acres, you can only drill wells that are capable of producing up to 400 gallons per minute. This works pretty well in areas where you have ag production that is not going to be producing 365 days a year. You're limiting the instantaneous production. The nature of the use has already limited the amount of days they can produce. I'm going to say in most cases where I know that this is in place, the aquifer would not support 4 gallons per minute per acre for 365 days a year. It's not the intent to limit a total volume. It's the intent to limit that instantaneous amount of development. Production limits based on historical use. Edwards Aquifer Authority. You got to prove up what you used at a certain period of history. This is what you're allowed to produce. It's pretty straightforward. It's got some limits, but particularly in a case where there is an emergency and we need to handle something right now, this handles it right now. Production limits based on an indicator well or spring flow. Everybody's heard of J17. Barton Springs has a rule in about their spring flow and the drought levels. And depending on what type of permit you have, you are limited based on what drought level you're in. They have this beautiful whole chart on their website. It's staged based on how bad the conditions are right now. It takes a lot of data to even develop a system like that, so you need to be aware of that going into it. This also really only works in an area where that indicator, the well or the spring flow, is indicative of the whole area. So in a karst system where you have cavities and you know that that level is kind of the same all over, that is not what's going on in aquifers where the production in this well doesn't really affect the production in this well over here or the water level in it. And so you have to be very mindful of what the situation is in your area. All right, so now I'm going to ask different questions. I'm going to kind of throw rocks at myself. What about the DFC? Any of these tools can be used to help you achieve a DFC. Measuring and meeting these tools does not mean you are meeting your DFC. I'm going to step on a soapbox for just a little bit, right over here. It's a different soapbox than the one I'm talking about. If you have a DFC, that is a stated goal. This is what you want to do. You should know if you are doing it. Do the measuring, the monitoring, and the analysis to make sure that you are doing those things, that you are meeting what your stated goal is. Keep in mind, I'm saying DFC, not MAG. MAG is an estimate of what you can produce to meet your DFC. Your DFC is the goal that you need to be knowing if you're meeting or not. We heard Perry this morning talking about they've tried multiple times to put some things into law that would require you to report whether you're meeting your DFC or not. Whether it's law or not, if you say you're going to do it, you should know if you're doing it. What about exceptions? It's going to come up. It's going to come up. Somebody's going to come to you and they're going to say, but we are important and we are special. And our situation is not like your rules. It's going to happen. Are you going to grant it? You need to consider it ahead of time. If somebody comes in and says, well, I'm not meeting spacing between wells, but they're both on my property and I'm not affecting anybody but myself, why would you make me? You need to know what your answer is. What about between neighbors? Are you going to allow a neighbor to grant an exception if somebody wants to drill a little too close to a property line? Well, it's only affecting that neighbor. Can the neighbor grant an exception? If the neighbor grants an exception, can he ask in return for the other neighbor to grant him back a blanket exception for wherever he wants to drill a well in the future sometime? It'll come up. Know ahead of time. Be prepared. Know ahead of time how you're planning to handle those situations. Enforcement. How are you going to enforce these things? Are you going to do a well site inspection? Are you going to inspect every time somebody comes in and asks for a permit? Are you going to require production reporting? Are you going to require people to put on meters and you're going to go read them? Again, if you say you're going to do it, if you have a rule, you need to know if we're doing it or not. We need to know if everybody's meeting it. Just have your plan in place. So when do I use what now? We've got a lot of options, a lot of tools in our toolbox. If there's 100 districts, there's 120 ways this is being done right now. And that's probably a conservative estimate. Where are you? What do you need to accomplish? What are the problems facing your district? What are the water resources in your district? This is the beauty and the difficulty of groundwater management in Texas. You have local people in control of your local water and for making the rules of your local water. And they know what is going on. They know what the public will accept or not accept. Lean on your local people, lean on your experts, have your data, make your decisions for your area. Because no matter if you're on I-20 or I-20 or Highway 83 or Highway 83, you got to find the size of boots that fit you. That's all I've got for you today. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
You have any questions? I do have one.
Okay.
I'm maybe naive in this, but with House Bill 2443 passing this last session about the petition to district rules, do you think spacing requirements in district rules are going to be heavily hit for these petitions?
It's my opinion, people always have the right to come ask a district to change a rule. There was always public comment. They could always come talk to your board. It's a public meeting. I don't feel that having this codified as an official process to be able to come talk to a board is going to change a whole lot, in my personal opinion, at least not for the districts I work in. I certainly don't work in all areas of Texas, but I don't think that they will be, I don't think that particularly spacing or whatever will be overly hit by that. I think that people always had the right to come to a public meeting and request things of the board and ask things of the board. And I don't think an official process is gonna change too much how much the rules change in a district.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank Amy.
Thanks, Michael.